I want to go to business school. I want to go to the very top business school. So I have 3 or 4 years to do it. What do I do under those circumstances?
Start looking at the schools a little bit. I'd probably start talking to people to understand what it takes and why you would want to get the MBA.
I think what a lot of applicants don't realize is that this is like taking on another part-time job. Application forms themselves
are really time-consuming.
That's right, absolutely.
You are differentiating yourself. You need to think deeply about your life, your experiences.
Good thinking takes time. Good essays take time. So how long does it take to write an essay? More than you'd think.
The point at which you give up on round one is the point at which you say to yourself, I'm not going to be able to put my highest quality application forward.
Hi, this is Harold Simansky with the mbaMission podcast. I'm here today with the founder of our company, as well as my co-host, Jeremy Shinewald. And also joining us today is our colleague, Gavriella Semaya. Hi, Gavi.
Hi, nice to see you guys both.
Your usual client gets in where? Harvard, Stanford, Wharton.
All the usual suspects, but on down the list too, Fuqua, NYU, Columbia. There's a wide range.
It's a wide range within like 17 schools.
A wide range within 17 schools. That's a good way of putting it. If you have the M7 and then the other 10. But
a few international suspects as well.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about when to begin the MBA application process.
And how to begin it when you decide when to begin it.
Yeah.
So conventionally, Harold, I think applicants think of the application process maybe a year-long affair, or if they start late, maybe even just a few months. But on today's podcast, we're going to walk through a variety of different milestones, points at which you can leap in and start your application. And I think the first one will actually surprise people. So we're going to go through milestones as far back as even like 5-6 years before a conventional application process. And don't worry, we will also get to that applicant who maybe just has a few months.
Right. You were saying 5 or 6 years before the process begins, and for some of us,
maybe the 5 or 6 years before they apply. That's when the process begins.
Exactly. And for some of us, and certainly some of our clients, it's sometimes 5 to 6 months, 5 to 6 weeks, 5 to 6 days.
Rarely 5 to 6 days.
Ideally not, but it does happen.
No. So rolling it all the way back.
Yeah.
Who is the person who starts thinking about this 5 years before?
Well, there's a new wave of applicant in the pool. And I think it's important that we talk about that applicant, the deferred applicant. And that is the individual who is applying when they're in their senior year of college. And it's interesting. I think a lot of people who apply in their senior year in college are finding about it in their senior year. And their friends are applying and they've got some FOMO and they're like, oh boy, I better apply. I better take the GMAT or the GRE quickly. Let's do this. Yeah. And so, there's a much longer horizon even for that individual. Maybe that starts in junior year for that individual.
Right.
But this is an individual where the benefits of applying actually can bleed into the normal cycle. If you're advising, Gabby, like someone who's in there who's applying for deferred admission, when do you think they should be starting?
If you work backwards from the deadline, it typically is in, mid to late April. So ideally, you'd be starting to think about this, 6 months prior to that, maybe before your winter break. So you can start, thinking about the various materials you need to put together, taking the GMAT, getting letters of recommendation. If you're really prepped, then you're thinking about it when you're doing your summer internships beforehand, because those are likely to be your recommenders, right? You want professional recommendations in an ideal world. So that's kind of when I would start thinking about it. And I'd start by looking at the application and figuring out what the requirements are so you know what you're working with.
Sure.
I've worked with a few deferred applicants or advised a few deferred applicants of late who've said to me, I've got a lighter semester in the second half of my junior year. I'm doing junior year in Barcelona or wherever it might be. And I think I'm actually going to study for the GMAT or the GRE during that time. So
I'm in Barcelona. There's no way I'm studying for the GMAT, but kudos to that person.
Other people who come home from their junior year and they say, okay, between the end of the school year and when I start my internship, I'll study for the GRE or the GMAT. So I think there is some prep that someone can do even during that time. I think some applicants sort of incidentally benefit from their engagement. They're just sincerely engaged in the college experience. Right. They're active in clubs and student government and newspapers, whatever it might be. But I think that's definitely something that you can plan for well in advance if you're listening to this.
Right. And I was just going to say this notion here of you are a student. GMAT or GRE is a big test. So you're in a test-taking mode as a student.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I was going to say, is that you're sort of already in this mindset of working on things like essays and applications. So in some ways, it's maybe more natural than leaping into that 5 years down the road when the last time you thought about an essay was,
And what is the bottleneck? as far as when you start this process? What's that first thing that you know if you don't get that right, then you simply can't apply?
Can I jump in with this one?
Sure.
It's getting good grades. I mean,
yeah,
that's where you are, right?
Right.
If you're
point.
determined to
Right.
get into your business school and you're planning this really early, I mean, you're basically a student who is trying to achieve academically and stand out academically.
Yes.
Your GPA is not going to get you into school, but you may as well have the best GPA that you can
Well,
have.
and the schools that offer these deferred programs are, do tend to be sort of the elite of the elite, right? It's Harvard, it's Wharton, it's Stanford, et cetera. So it's imperative to have those kind of table stakes things like good grades, like being engaged on campus. If you don't have that raw material, you're sort of starting from a deficit.
Especially because when you're a deferred applicant, you are asking the school to make a bet on you, and they've got uncertain data. I always say it's almost like you're a VC bet. Like you're asking them to invest in you, and the outcomes are really unknown. You're not a private equity bet where it's like you're stable, and so I think. What are you going to do to reassure them? Well, you're going to have good grades. You're going to have a strong GMAT score, a strong GRE score. It doesn't mean exclusively. Yes, if you can show competence in other ways. The nature of an average is not everyone can be above average, but those are, again, we're talking table stakes are, GPA, GRE or GMAT, and then pretty strong engagement because that's what they're judging on. They don't have your work experience to judge you off of.
Right.
Yes, you can do really well in your summer internship, but it's probably other aspects of engagement in your college life.
You know what I always find interesting is this notion here of when I work with deferred applicants, probably now more than ever. Right now, I think we're looking at about 60 students in the Wharton MBA class are going to be deferred applicants. So when I start working with folks who are deferred applicants, what I also say to them is, listen, this can be the start of a process that is that multi-year process. Right. Where you start off, and at that point then, you really get the ball rolling because there's a lot that can translate into future applications.
That's why I wanted to set the stage in college, because everything you do, like your GMAT or your GRE, they're good for 5 years. So many applicants that I'm meeting now will say, I took it in senior year. I thought about applying as a deferred applicant, or I did apply as a deferred applicant. My GMAT's good for like another year. I want to apply now because I don't want to take that test again. Like I'm 4 years out professionally. I've been a consultant. I've been in marketing, whatever I've been doing. And
I think that's
I've been able to score well on this. The best foundation you can lay for yourself, and all that is translatable to being a great applicant, is all that whole college foundation.
Well, and we always say that ideally you have the test out of the way when you start working on the applications because it's one less thing to worry about. And so if you did it in college, in your senior year of college, all the better, right? You don't have to think about it at all.
No, absolutely. And Gavi, as you think about starting this process, again, years beforehand, you're someone who didn't actually apply deferred. What else are you thinking about doing 2, 3, or maybe even longer before you actually end up applying?
I think, most importantly, I'd probably start looking at the schools a little bit. I'd probably start talking to people to understand what it takes. And I think why you would want to get the MBA, right? I think we're sort of assuming that you've made that decision with certainty. But I think when you're 3-4 years out, you're probably still figuring out what that looks like for you. What do you want to do? And if you have goals, maybe you start working towards them, setting yourself up for them.
And that really helps you to execute, because as Harold sort of said at the beginning in a cheeky way, for the 5-hour or 5-day applicant isn't going to have the time to really do the homework for their personal statements, and maybe they'll have a little time for their interview, I suppose, to do some of that homework. But like, it's one thing to quickly scan the website and throw in a few classes in your essay. Like, that's not a winning strategy. It's if you're really speaking the language of the school, if you've engaged with students and alumni and you really understand how the school operates, what's unique about it, you've hopefully had the opportunity to visit campuses to the extent that's possible for you. It's not totally critical. You've maybe attended some online chats or spoken with a student ambassador. There are so many ways to get to know the schools at this point. And then it just seems effortless when you're talking about why you want to be at that school. You're not kind of from recall being like, oh, what was that? What was that class? What was that? Oh, I've got 3 classes in operations. I'll mention those.
That's right.
It's far more seamless. And that's the type of research that can be done over the long haul, to the point where it just becomes easy for you.
Right. And it's the anti-chat GPT research.
Right.
Honestly, as I work with these clients, one of the things that I see as a real point of distinction is their knowledge of the school. And this notion here of not just have they been there, but have actually gone and spoken to people who go there.
Okay, we're talking about the aspects of a profile that translates. But of course, there are applicants who are kind of conventional applicants who maybe, they get into their career. They never thought about an MBA.
Right.
And they're thinking about it now, like, wow, I've grown in my career. We're talking someone maybe who's well prepared, who's 2 years out.
Right.
Do your homework.
Yeah. Right.
Sign up for a test.
Yeah.
What else? What else can we do?
Well, I'm going to ask Gavi this. Let's say I am the opposite of of your usual deferred applicant. I'm actually have not been a successful student in school. I want to go to business school. I want to go to the very top business school. So I have 3 or 4 years to do it. What do I do under those circumstances?
Well, so self-awareness is half the battle. You want to prove your academic abilities, right? That's the idea. And so how would you do that? With academic evidence. So ideally you take a course, whether it's Harvard's core credential of readiness, which is sort of like the pinnacle of pre-MBA courses, but you can also do things like Wharton's business analytics. There are countless certificates that you can get to demonstrate that academic readiness. And again, it's one of those things where ideally you've done that beforehand. So you kind of have that in your back pocket. You've established that part. You're not doing it while you are working on the applications.
Right. And working on the GMAT.
And working on
doing
the
your
GMAT.
job. And everything else. Raising your children, walking your dog, whatever it might be.
And I would say the other, the other, long haul things that you can do are sort of what we talked about before with college. But always do our free consultations. Anyone out there who's watching this can do a free half hour with me, with Harold, with Gavi, with any member of our team. And as the season, which we'll get into an actual application season, but as the season starts and people get closer to application deadlines, inevitably my consults start saying to me, what can I do now to be a better applicant?
Right.
And it's like, it's July. Round one is in September. Like, you can't change.
There's only so much you can change in 3 months. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't. So, the things that you can do 2 years out, it's meaningful to take on a volunteer project, to pursue your passion project. It's not meaningful to do that 3 weeks before the deadline. And so, it's not window dressing. I always say to people, this isn't a prison sentence. When it comes to community service, you're not like serving a certain number of hours or time to impress the admissions committee. What they're looking for is an individual who can say, hey, I've got, similar grades and at GMAT or GRE to others, or I'm in this competitive pool, or I'm even a little bit above, whatever that is, or I'm a little below, and I've got my work experience. Like, everyone has those. That's the nature of an applicant. Right. Here with community service or your personal project, these are areas where you can outperform others.
Right.
So,
that's right.
And it doesn't need to be that you're, the mayor of your small town, or you're, the head of the United Way campaign.
Right.
You can differentiate as long as you're passionate by being an excellent, amateur photography coach or whatever. Maybe that's a ridiculous example, but
I think that's right. Listen,
whatever it is, whatever you're passionate about, if you're teaching anyone anything, it doesn't have to be teaching. It can be anything.
Yeah, time gives you the opportunity to differentiate yourself. That's really the bottom line.
Well, and you don't need to do 18 different things. It's better to do a couple of things meaningfully and well, right? And I think one of the things we always say that the schools are looking for is not just kind of passive membership or participation, but showing some kind of initiative. Are you adding value versus just being present, which is a start, but the longer horizon you have, the more likely you are to be able to have an impact.
Yeah, real impact. The personal part of your life can actually be quite important too. I think it's important to think about the personal side of your application as well. If you are an amateur podcaster like us, if you're an amateur podcaster and you're really, really committed to it and you've grown, you don't need to be the next Joe Rogan. You just need to show that there's some spirit in it, some intellectual curiosity, some ability that you have. If you're applying to business school and you've interviewed 50 people about inflection points in their life, I'm making it up. That level of commitment to this topic is something that's going to make an impression and make a statement about who you are.
I've been working with a client. I'm now going to disguise who it is. But over the last 2 years, he has done a podcast. He simply, wherever he goes, he does a man on the street interview. And he's done it across the world. And this is only possible because he started 2 years ago. And it's not that he travels every week. He travels once in a while. But if you travel once a month, twice a month, and you do that for 2 years, he has podcasts now, 25 podcasts, and that is really meaningful and is really a point of differentiation when you go to apply to business school.
And just to be clear, we're not advocating for podcasts just because we're podcasts. We're talking this as an individual, personal passion project.
Yes,
Your personal passion project can be It can be organic farming. It can be photography. It can be helping a friend with their startup.
Right.
It can be helping a relative, a young relative get through school. It can be anything. And these are the stories that actually, in many ways, no one can tell. Like someone can tell that story about, I'm a consultant and I worked really hard on that project, and I worked really late and gave a tremendous deliverable. And like, that's not to deride that story. That's a perfectly fine story, and someone can tell that story about how they coached the basketball team, or again they were. But like the story of, I traveled around the world. And again, this is a disguised example, but I traveled around the world and interviewed people and helped to raise awareness of different parts of the world, whatever it is. That's that person's story, basically. That's that. No one else in the pool is telling that story this year. And these are the things that you can do if you're planning ahead. So
and you get credibility.
Yeah. So we've talked about like a 5-year plan that sort of bleeds into a 2-year plan, or into a 3-4-year plan. I don't know. And we've talked about kind of a 2-year plan. Really making sure that you're prepping. You can do some of these things if you're starting a year out. So let's maybe we can just delineate when a season begins from our perspective, when it begins from an admissions perspective, maybe even when it begins from a candidate perspective.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you think about it, I always work back from the application timeline, right? So clients will often start thinking about it. I would say the majority around January, February, you're looking at the next application cycle, because usually if you've passed the round 2 deadline, then, there's a small pool of round 3, but for the most part, you're looking at round 1 next fall. So round 1 deadlines are typically early September. Round 2 is early January. And then round 3 is March, April. But again, that's a much smaller percentage. So for the most part, if you're looking at round 1, which is the majority of applicants, the applications themselves don't open until the summer, June, July. So it's prior to that you're really thinking about what's the raw material I have here. The essays themselves aren't usually confirmed or released until around May, June. So at the most, prior to that, you're really thinking about the raw material of your profile, right? What do you have to work with? Where might I need to strengthen things? Do I have my test? Do I need to take an extra course? Those kinds of things.
At that point, if you're starting in January, you can still build a credible track record in your community service. Like it's not ideal, but you can still say, okay, if I'm committed between January and September when I apply, that's 9 months. And if I'm truly, truly impactful, it's not just window dressing, then I could achieve something and make it meaningful. We wish you had started earlier.
Our colleague Rachel talks about this a lot. And for those of you who don't know Rachel, she's been on earlier podcasts. She is a straight talker. There's no question about it. And she will simply say to people, it's January. Do you want to have your application have no community service, or do you want to have some community service? And the reality is, in January, you can still credibly do community service. In September, weeks before the deadline, obviously a whole different strategy.
You can also start picking up projects at work. I think we haven't kind of talked about that too, right? But if, demonstrating leadership at work, those are the time to start thinking about that. I'll talk about that with a lot of consults, is, can you pick up a project? Can you initiate something? Can you join a committee, right? The work front, too, is still flexible at that point. Once you're in September, you've done what you've done.
Right. So just to put a fine point on that, like, anything from joining the diversity committee or running training. And not everything has to have like a title. You can be a really good mentor to someone who's junior to you and have a really nice story to write, even if you weren't officially designated as a mentor by your firm, top down through the mentorship program. Doesn't matter. So the other thing, we're talking about January. We're kind of talking about the latest now, I would say, starting your test prep, because test prep can take 3-4 months. 4 or 5 months is more common. If you start in January, that puts you right up against when essays come out in May, right? May is the 5th month it is, And so, you're not giving yourself a lot of leeway. If you start in March of your application year, you start taking a standardized test, then you're bumping up against August. Well,
I know
that's crunch time.
That is tight.
September,
that is
right?
Very, very, very
so
tight.
People do it, but it's not optimal. And by listening to this podcast, you can not have that path.
So Gavi, when is if you've done the GRE, the GMAT, when should you really start buckling down?
You can't really think about the essays until they come out, right? I mean, you can do some sort of reflection, certainly on your career goals, things like that, but you're not drafting anything, in advance unless you really enjoy spinning your wheels and possibly having to rewrite them. That's when I typically really start the heavy brainstorming. But ahead of that, you can do things like fine tune your resume, right? Which is independent of the application, independent of the school. So I'll get that out of the way. I might start thinking about my recommenders, trying to get as much done that is independent of the essays and independent of the applications, so that again, you're minimizing what you have to focus on when it really comes down to the final stretch.
Yeah.
I think what a lot of applicants don't realize is that this is like taking on another part-time job.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
Like if you're applying to 3, 4, 5 schools, that's reasonable. Some applicants will apply to 6 schools in the first round. I think after about 6 or 7, like if you're not getting to one of those schools, you're probably targeting the wrong schools. So if you're committed to getting to business school, I would say 6, 7 schools, unless there's some massive anomaly in your profile that you're worried about. That's probably enough for you to cover your bases. But if you're doing that, that is like taking on a full-time job, not even a part-time job. And so you have to be organized and you have to be ready to go when the essays come out that May.
Right. And just to recap, hopefully you've taken your GMAT or GRE. Hopefully you've spoken to students or recent alumni of this school, and hopefully you've done a really good job at work. So you have your recommenders sort of lined up.
Imagine if you haven't done that. Imagine if you can still be an okay applicant, but imagine if come May, you're like, I have to do a standardized test. I have to take maybe HBS core to shore up my quantitative bona fides. I'm kind of short on community service here. Maybe I skip that, or maybe I try at a last ditch to build something in my profile. I have to do research. I have to keep up with my job. I've got a social life. Something's got to give. You can't do all those things. And that's why organization becomes critical.
Right. And if you don't like a deadline looming at you, you know who really doesn't like a deadline like that? Your recommenders. At that point, they are petrified. So, Gavi, when do you start speaking to your recommenders, and what do those first conversations sound like?
To me, there's sort of 2 phases, right? One is getting them on board and getting them aligned. So, that's the initial conversation of, hey, I'm planning, to apply for my MBA, and I would love for you to be a recommender, and so on and so forth, right? Once they're on board, then there's kind of the more tactical conversation around, this is what it's going to look like. You're going to get an email from the schools. Here's some material, some suggestions, and so on. I, usually give recommenders, or I advise my clients to give their recommenders, 6 to 8 weeks at most. You don't want to give them months on end, because then it's just going to fall by the wayside. It'll be on the back burner. They'll forget about it.
Right.
And you don't want to give them, 3 or 4 weeks, because at that point, you're sort of putting a lot of pressure on them. And most of them appreciate the heads up.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Listen, the joke I have with my clients, and I say that to every one of them, and nobody actually likes it, is if you give a recommender 2 weeks to write a recommendation, they'll write it in 2 weeks. If you give a recommender 2 months to write a recommendation, they'll write it in 2 weeks. So you really have to spend a little bit of time, I think, grooming your recommendations, thinking about them, and then actually having good conversations with recommenders not 2 weeks beforehand.
I think one thing also that people bump up with the deadlines is, we've talked about ourselves. We've sort of ignored it to this point ourselves. So it's not a surprise that applicants will ignore this. But they take they do their test prep, they work on their essays, they work on their resume, they talk to the recommenders, and the application forms themselves
are really time consuming.
That's right, absolutely.
And they're not just like your mother's middle name or something like that.
I just had that conversation with the client yesterday, where I was saying, you know what, in your spare time between the essay writing and the edits and all that, start chipping away at it, because the last thing you want is the day before the application is due to be sitting there worrying about, am I goofing on something? You have to look up your salary numbers and things like that. Get it out of the way.
And then there are actual qualitative short answers in a lot of them.
Absolutely.
Give the viewer a sense of some of the types of things you might have to detail.
Fun things like describing your job in 250 characters or less, spaces included, or a key accomplishment and key challenge for every job that you've held. Describing your extracurriculars. These are not things you want to be firing off. I mean,
awards, even if you've won an award, you have to be able to say the basis by which you were selected. Do you remember when you got that best research paper? Do you remember exactly what the criteria was? Do you remember the name of the award? All these little details that you just have to be able to track down, and trying to do that the night before, not a good idea.
Yeah. In fact, many of us at mbaMission have a deadline, a soft deadline, the month before the application. You better be done with all of that stuff. We don't want to be talking about your resume anymore. We don't want to be talking about your short answers, because it takes a long time.
You know what I try to do to motivate my applicants at times? I will say, a month before the deadline, I want to give you this week where I promise I will expedite the return of your short answers just to get them out of the way, so that you are not rushing with this at the last minute. You have to keep the reader learning as they go through those short answers. If you're just kind of saying like copy and pasting for your resume, or are, you know, just offering the banalities of your job. Like as a, you know, as an analyst in an investment bank, I can conduct analysis for, you know, others and support.
Yes.
You know, so
I meet with stakeholders and so on.
Right, that's right. Okay, Gabe, so TikTok, it's 2 months before the application is due. At that point, what are you working on? What are you doing?
At that point, I mean, assuming you're starting with nothing, I mean, that's kind of when you got to start parallel pathing things, right? So I always sort of look at which essays map to one another to try to make it somewhat more efficient. But I mean, you've got to be working on your resume. You've got to be, you know, I would get out those recommendation kind of packets or any kind of guidance, get that lined up as soon as possible. And then I would start, you know, working on the essays. Just know that it sort of works like a funnel, right? You build up kind of an arsenal of materials at some point.
This isn't so scientific, but I'm like, okay, if the first file is going to take you 10x.
Yeah.
The second one might take you 6x. And the third one might take you 3x. And after that, they're probably all 3 to 2x, like, and so you're going to find some efficiencies, and people panic because it's a lot. It's a lot.
Right.
I don't blame you if you're starting 2 months early.
There's so many moving parts to keep track of.
But once you get your resume done, your resume is applicable to all files, basically. Once you get your recommenders moving, they are going to have to make some adjustments, but that's on them. It's up to you to educate them.
But I mean, all the more important to be organized, At that point, map it out because things fall through the cracks. You will forget something at the last minute. So get the lay of the land and figure out what you need to do.
And the best part about the application process for applicants is that the deadlines are right at the time you just do not want to be doing the work, right?
That's right.
So like, it's the end of summer.
Right. It's right after Labor Day or it's right after New Year's.
I could go on a Labor Day excursion with my friends. Or I can sit here and work on essays. Oh yeah, it's New Year's Day. Thanks for making the deadline tomorrow. So it's especially difficult if you're leaving things to the deadline. You mentioned the third round. For those who are uneducated, tell them about the third round and why that may not be where they want to go, especially.
Yeah. So round 3, it exists. Obviously, they wouldn't have it if they weren't admitting clients in round 3 or applicants, I should say. But the truth is that it's a small percentage of the overall class, right? If you think about it, it's the most competitive, not because it's more selective necessarily, but the majority of seats are filled, right? So you're now vying for a much smaller number of seats. And they've already started shaping the class. So especially if you're from kind of that overrepresented, background, odds are you really have to stand out at that point for them to say, you know what, we don't have, they're not lacking for, finance applicants at that point.
No, they're really looking to fill profiles. I'll tell my clients, quite honestly, they're looking for astronauts.
Yeah, I think that's what saying, like every year we have one Bolivian applicant in the class. We haven't got one yet. Let's keep our eyes open. Or our class is a little,
heavy in this way.
Yeah. It's like a shaping round to give you a sense of how competitive that round can be. Harvard Business School doesn't even have a third round anymore. They had to have just looked at their files and said, you know what? We're just not accepting people in this round. Why are we putting people through the trauma of it? Now, that said, I can think of a time a couple of years ago where you helped an overrepresented PE applicant get in the third round.
Yes.
To one of the, let's call it one of the elite schools. That way we can disguise it sufficiently. The top 3 elite schools, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly possible. As I said, they wouldn't have the round if they weren't admitting people, but you really have to think about what differentiates you at that point. I often talk about, is it worth applying in round 3? Yes, but be prepared too that you might need to reapply just because, not because you're, not a qualified applicant, but because it's just so hard to break through at that point. You really have to highlight what differentiates you.
I remember the MIT former admissions director saying, a rejection isn't a life sentence. So you can apply in the third round anticipating that maybe it won't work out for you. But I think the point is keep developing your profile. Like don't just stand still at that point. You have to keep growing.
Yeah. Which actually begs the question then of, okay, when do you decide to go from a round 1 application to a round 2 application? When do you basically say, I'm out of time, what do I do now? And how important is it to get into round 1 versus round 2?
The point at which you give up on round 1 is the point at which you say to yourself, I'm not going to be able to put my highest quality application forward. And so I've run out of time to do my best with this application. You are far better off with a better round 2 application than a rushed round 1 application. All things being equal, we'd like to see our applicants, we'd like to be a round 1 firm.
Right.
Everyone applies in round 1 and we're done and we just wait.
Right.
That's not human nature. That's not the way it works. It doesn't mean you can't get in round 2. There are lots and lots of spaces available in round 2, but game theory would tell you, right? You want to be trying to get something, trying to get a spot in that class when it's wide open. Right. It's just mathematically, your chances are better, even if they are like holding over a proportional number of applicants to the second round. So not to overstate it, if you're a great applicant, you can get in the second round, but our preference would be that great applicant in the first round.
Right. Gabi, have you ever had the conversation where someone is shooting for round 1 and you had to say to them, listen, round 2 is just going to be better for you?
All the time. I think, season after season or year after year, right? Because inevitably things happen. Life comes up, you get sidetracked by something. For whatever reason, it just doesn't come together. And you have to look at the reality of, okay, I'm 3 weeks out now. Would I feel confident, pulling the trigger on this? Right. And if the answer is no, then you're better off taking the time. But again, don't then wait another 2 months.
That's right.
All the
Exactly
more
right.
reason to kind of light the fire and say, okay, now I've given myself an extra 3 months. It's time to really buckle down so that I can feel really good when I hit that round 2 application.
And I say this to clients all the time. Fine, push to the next round. I agree with you. However, if you're going to push the next round, and if we're going to do it the last 2 weeks, let's just do it right now.
Yeah. My clientele tends to weight strongly towards consulting and private equity. And it's interesting because when you talk to some of these applicants, it's like they're like, "Oh, I am so exhausted right now. I've been traveling. I'm on a live deal, whatever it is, and I've got a few days now. I'm gonna start this process." And you're like, "You have a few days. Like, remember what it felt like 2 days ago. You don't know when that's going to happen again.
Right. That's
like,
right.
let's use every minute starting now. And like, what happens if this happens to you December 10th, what are you going to do? So we've got to be well prepared.
Yeah, or the flip side, I'm taking 10 days off at the end of the year to work on my applications.
Yes.
You don't work on it 24/7. It's not like you're going to be sitting there doing nothing but applications during those 10 days. So sure, it's helpful, but that doesn't compensate for, what would otherwise be months of work spread out.
Again, it doesn't make for the best application. How do you get the best application? How do you differentiate yourself? You know the schools, you speak to people, you start talking to recommenders early. At that point, then you're really ready to go. You take your GMAT. At that point, you're ready to go. And all of this is possible if you start the process early. If you start the process months, years.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points that may have been lost here is that in doing all that research about schools, it's not just about making your application better. You might actually identify schools that work for you or don't work for you. You might say, wow, I didn't realize I don't want to go to that program. That's not for me. This is a lifetime commitment
investment.
For you.
That's right.
You're doing it once.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You're doing it once. So you may as well, if you're only applying to 6 schools, you make sure, or 4 or 3 or 2, you may as well make sure that they're the right programs for you. Like every year, someone inevitably comes back and says I went to Harvard Business School. I'm not sure the case method is a good thing for me, as if it's like a problem with them. Every school, no matter how strong the school's reputation is, it doesn't matter, what the reputation is. The school's got to be an academic and social fit for you. And doing that homework, if you're leaving at the last minute, you could be attending a school that you don't even realize. But if you happen to put together the compelling application, happen to get in, you might get there on day 1 and be like, wow, I really should have known more about this program.
I had a client who, got into her top schools and then after the fact realized, actually, I should have gone to school number 2 and went through the whole process of trying to switch. And it's just not, it's not practical. It's not doable. So do that work up front. I also think the reflection process is time consuming.
That's true.
And we've kind of glossed over that. If you are differentiating yourself, you need to think deeply about your life, your experiences. It's hard to come up with something that's not boilerplate or that's not superficial, last minute.
Good thinking takes time. Good essays take time. It's how long does it take to write an essay? More than you'd think.
One other milestone that we've sort of ignored is, we're not ignored, it's sort of lurking in the background here is if you get your application done in September and you get interviewed in October, November, and you get in late December, you're not even starting school until the following August. Like this isn't like, oh, I completed my application and when do I start? Like you still have a whole bunch of other unwinding to do in your life. You might have to move cities, you might have to quit your job. Maybe you want to take the once in a lifetime trip. You want to, whatever it might be. You're planning over a year before you're going. If you're starting in January of this year, you could be, if everything goes well in the first round, admitted 12 months later and then go to school 8 months after that, 9 months after that. So it's a really, really long process in and of itself. And again, it's something you might need to do twice if you're planning to take a risky, I'm only applying to my number one school this year, and if I go, then that's fine. And that's a strategy. That's fine. That's your choice. But you might end up reapplying. So it might be a 2-year and 8-month process. It can be really, really time consuming and take over people's lives.
At the end of the day, you need a lot of time to do really good applications. And if you can really, pull that calendar back, if you can really start early, it matters. It really does.
So if you are planning to apply in 2025, it's a good time to start thinking about how that's going to shape up for you over the coming months.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly go to our website, mbaMission.com, sign up for a free 30-minute consultation, whether it's with Gavi or Jeremy or me or any one of our 20-plus consultants. We can help you think through when deadlines may make the most sense for you.
Yeah, we've helped thousands of applicants from all around the world, every professional background. And what's interesting is everyone has their own distinct story to tell. The diversity of applicants we have is, even if you are from an overrepresented pool professionally, you have so many differences personally. And those are the things that are really fun to explore as professionals.
Yeah, and the earlier we get to know you, the more we can start kind of tailoring a path for you and building that profile and getting on your side and building that relationship too, because it's a long haul. And so, it helps to start early.
Well, great. Let's sign off. Gavi, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Good talking to you guys.
Nice talking to you as well.
See you next time on the MBA Mission podcast.